All the rolling go, where am I to go? Meet Johnny, where am I to go? For I'm a young and a sailor lad, and where am I to go?
Hello, and welcome to Where Am I to Go podcast. Today we are in Kansas City, Missouri. Kansas City is totally fascinating to me. We pulled in yesterday, drove around through some of the old stockyards area. There's so many old buildings down there, so much to see. The town is much, much bigger than what I ever thought it would be. Huge buildings, cool downtown. We're staying in Independence, so we get to drive in and see the city skyline from quite a ways out. And this is just such a cool place as far as a big city goes. Today, we happen to be at the TWA Museum, which is in Kansas City itself, and we are going to take a tour with our guide, Larry. But along with Larry, we've got a couple of other guests that showed up at the museum, Paul and Karen. So they may ask some questions as we're on our way, and hopefully we have a lot of fun with this. I don't know that much about TWA. I do know that it stands for Trans World Airlines, and we are going to go from there and get a little bit of airplane history. Welcome to Where Am I to Go podcast, Larry, Paul, and Karen.
Thank you.
Okay, Paul.
Are we good to go?
Yeah, we are.
Well, we're actually standing in the original headquarters building. Here's the building you're in right now as it appeared in 1931 when it was dedicated by Charles Lindbergh.
By Charles Lindbergh.
Yes.
Okay, we're talking about the World War I ace.
We're talking about the guy that flew the North Atlantic for the first time in 1927
Wow.
in the Spirit of St. Louis. And in fact, there is the Spirit of St. Louis.
Oh, you're saying Lindbergh.
Lindbergh,
yes. Okay. I got my guys mixed up.
All right.
We're a little bit ahead of my time.
We got the right guy now?
We got the right guy now.
Good deal. Here is the Spirit of St. Louis sitting in the grass outside. This was not taken at the building dedication. This was taken in 1928 during his victory lap tour of America after flying the North Atlantic.
Okay.
We were initially more interested in actually flying mail rather than passengers. There was more money in that. And we did that in the Northrop Alpha. One pilot and an open cockpit, and it carried exactly one passenger who had the cabin all to his or herself. There was no seat for the passenger. They had to sit on the mail bags.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they did.
I guess you can arrange those in such a way that you didn't wrinkle them up too bad
A
when you
little
made a
before
recliner.
my time, but I'm glad I wasn't around for that. We got our start in the passenger business with the Fokker there that you see in the display case, which was built of wood and fabric. And we very quickly discovered that wooden airplanes and Oklahoma thunderstorms were not a good mix. We had a couple of fatal crashes early on, including one that killed the football coach, Newt Rockney.
Oh, okay.
And so we decided we wanted out of that business, and we wrote to Henry Ford,
Okay.
and said, we need an all-metal airplane because wooden fabric is not going to cut it, and the result was the Ford Trimotor. We operated a reasonably large fleet of Ford Trimotors throughout the 1930s.
Okay.
And in fact, we made the promise with the Trimotor, because there was no flying at night in those days, we could get you coast to coast in only 48 hours. And
Really?
We did that by putting you on a train overnight in New York, and you took the overnight train to Columbus, where you flew all day long, multiple stops to Winoka, Oklahoma, another train overnight to Clovis, New Mexico, and then finally you ended up in Glendale, California.
Okay, now did they take the trains at night because they
There
didn't
was no
have
night
instrumentation?
There was no night flying in the 1930s.
Okay.
And in fact, one of the things that we worked on with our consultant, Charles Lindbergh, and Amelia Earhart, was proving night flying, as well as radio navigation, icing conditions, absorbing lightning strikes. And we did that with a Lockheed Electra, which was our quote-unquote flying research laboratory, which I'll show you out in the hangar. We have the airplane here.
Oh, wow. So at the time when they were not night flying, did they have big arrows on the ground that showed you where to go? Or was IFR, did that mean I follow road?
I follow roads. They typically had pretty primitive navigation equipment, some of which you see a little bit here.
Okay, you had some altimeters and some of that.
Even
kind of
in
stuff.
those days, there was in-flight service on board. The first flight attendants on the Ford Trimotor were actually male stewards, and they were often assisted by the first officer who would come out of the cockpit and pour coffee. Part of the job description for the stewards was to know the best restaurants near airports to pick up the fried chicken and potato salad to serve on the airplane. And they were actually issued the silverware, and part of their job responsibility was to wash the dishes between legs so that they could use it on the next leg.
Wow.
We didn't start hiring female flight attendants until 1935. The very first class was in 1935. And pretty soon I'll show you the uniform for that. We'll go back over to where we started here.
Okay. And as we're standing here in the lobby, in the original office, like he said, we've got glass cases that go all the way around the walls. He's got lots of model airplanes that are the planes that TWA was flying, from the tri-engine on up through jet airplanes. They've got quite the display of model airplanes. They've got several uniforms. As you come on around, they've got more uniforms, some of the instrumentation that he was talking about, first aid kits, and there's a lot of memorabilia here.
There is, quite a bit.
Yes.
So we ended up with the Ford Trimotor in the 1930s and our one Lockheed Electra, which I mentioned is here. I did not know this, but in the 1930s, Boeing and United Airlines were divisions of the same company.
Oh, really?
And Boeing designed the first modern low-wing airliner, the Boeing 247, and only United Airlines could operate it. So we wanted something to compete as fast as possible with the Boeing 247. We wrote to all the aircraft manufacturers and said, what can you come up with? And one of the people who responded was Donald Douglas at Douglas Aircraft.
Okay.
And the result was the DC-1, which begat the DC-2, which ultimately became the DC-3. And we operated many DC-3s throughout the 30s and throughout the 40s as well.
And how many passengers would those planes carry?
Depending on the configuration. Some of them were set up with berths for sleeping, and they only held, I believe, 14. And ultimately, the DC-3 had a capacity of 21.
Okay.
One flight attendant, two pilots. And notoriously, the cockpit was notoriously not watertight, and they hated flying in rain because the cockpit always leaked.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah. Our first pressurized airplane was the Boeing Stratoliner you see there. We took delivery of a grand total of 5, and unfortunately they were delivered just in time for World War II. They were immediately confiscated by the Army Air Corps. The first thing they did was remove all the pressurization equipment. We were excited about being able to get above the weather with a pressurized airplane. And they used the airplane to fly multiple supply and troop missions throughout the war. After World War II, they said, here are your airplanes back, but we have no idea what we've done with the pressurization equipment.
Oh.
They'd removed it to increase the range and the payload. So after the war, it was not a very good idea to continue operating the airplane, and we got rid of it.
Okay, so now Boeing allowed you guys to buy 5 of those.
By that time, we could buy 5 of those.
Okay, so they weren't still...
The only other airline that bought it, to my knowledge, is Pan Am.
Okay.
And there is a surviving Pan Am Stratoliner in the Uwe Hodze Museum at Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
It had the misfortune of being restored by folks up in the Pacific Northwest, and they were flying it around Seattle on a proving flight and ran out of gas and ditched the airplane in Elliott Bay in Seattle, and then they got to restore it all over again.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
You would think a test pilot would understand that he needed fuel in order to go someplace.
Rule number 1, you make sure you got enough gasoline in the airplane.
Yeah.
During World War II, our pilots flew literally thousands of supply and troop missions in support of the war throughout Europe and also into Africa to support those efforts. And they did that primarily in the Douglas DC-4, which was also unpressurized. And late in the war, they were supplemented by the very first prototype, or not prototype, but production models of the Lockheed Constellation. Our owner in the 1930s, Howard Hughes, was instrumental in the design of the Lockheed Constellation, and the story goes that the original design only had 2 vertical stabilizers. You'll see 3 there in the model. Hughes insisted that they add a 3rd one, but make all of them much smaller so that it would fit through the hangar door for maintenance.
Wow. So Howard Hughes owned this company also.
30s, 40s, and 50s, until ultimately, as he became increasingly eccentric, we sued to have him removed from the property. And unfortunately, that litigation lasted something like 25 years, and ultimately we prevailed, but guess who got the money?
Howard.
Carl Icahn.
Oh, Carl Icahn. Now, that's a name we weren't supposed to mention.
I know.
I was pre-warned
I
by
know.
Paul and Karen not to mention his name.
This particular model is the 1649 Constellation, which was the final version of the airplane. It had a stretched fuselage, an all-new wing, and more importantly, brand new, highly complex engines, which were notoriously unreliable. I grew up here in Kansas City, and my neighbor was a 1649 captain for TWA, and he said he had so many engine failures on that airplane, he called it the best 3-engine airplane he ever flew.
Wow.
The airplane was short-lived because we got it in 1955, I believe, and by 1959 we had the 707.
Okay. And the 707 was jet.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
The initial 707 we called the water wagon. It was a pure turbojet rather than a turbofan, notoriously underpowered. So for takeoff in places like Kansas City with kind of a short runway, we had to inject thousands of gallons of distilled water into the engines on takeoff, and the steam created additional thrust to get the airplane off the ground. My background at TWA, I was a flight attendant, one of the first male flight attendants, and I started on the water wagon. And if you were sitting on the back jump seat on takeoff, when they turned the water on, it was so abrupt that you'd slam your head on the bulkhead behind you.
Really?
And about 40 seconds later, they turned the water off, and it would throw you into your jump seat the opposite direction. Needless to say, the water wagon was not my favorite airplane. And fortunately, we had those replaced with the first turbofan airplanes. And the 707 we operated up until about 1983 or 84, maybe even 85.
Okay.
Through the years. But the water wagon on takeoff created not only a huge amount of noise, but enormous clouds of black smoke.
Wow.
I can't say I miss it.
Well, it's interesting that adding the extra water weight didn't offset the extra thrust that you got.
Well, we burned through it very quickly on takeoff.
Okay.
We also operated a variety of airplanes throughout the 50s and the 1960s, the Martin 202 and then the Martin 404, the Convair 880, the DC-9, the 727, both the regular and the stretch version. The 880 is kind of interesting. Howard Hughes was all about speed, and apparently he was not a huge fan of the original 707. So he convinced Convair out in San Diego to build the 880, which was a smaller, faster jetliner that was designed for short to medium haul. It was extremely fast. The engines on the Convair 880 were civilian versions of the same engine that powered the F4 Phantom fighter.
Oh.
So it was fast. And as a flight attendant, I can also tell you it was cramped, uncomfortable, and loud. And I had the misfortune of having to work at the final summer that we operated, and I believe the summer of 1974. And because it was so fast, every pilot in the system, it seemed, was trying to set a new speed record between every city pair in the country. And in those days, we had some sort of in-flight service on every single leg. I'm particularly remembering liquor and dinner from Chicago to Kansas City, and I think we actually made that in the 880 in 52 minutes flat.
Wow.
So we were making fools of ourselves in the back, running up and down trying to get the service done, while the pilots were setting new speed records.
Okay. Now, were these supersonic planes?
No, not at all. But they were roughly 25 miles an hour faster than the 707.
Okay.
And it was short-lived as well because it was also an enormous fuel pig, which didn't matter when jet fuel was about $0.10 a gallon.
Right.
But it was gone in 1974.
I was going to say the early 70s gas prices did a major jump. So,
Yep. In fact, the first oil shortage in 1974 was the end of the conveyor.
Okay.
We're noted primarily for the 747, and we operated a variety of models of that airplane, including the SP, the short fuselage version. But the airplane that, in my mind anyway, was a better aircraft overall was the Lockheed 1011. That airplane was not a sales success because Rolls-Royce got ahead of themselves and couldn't make the engines work properly. And in fact, the engine problems bankrupted Rolls-Royce in 1970, and the British government fought for a couple of years on whether or not they were going to pay to bail out Rolls-Royce, which they ultimately did. But in that 2-year delay, McDonnell Douglas sold a heck of a lot of DC-10s, and the 1011 was not a sales success. But the 1011 was way ahead of its time. It was the only airliner, except I believe there was one British airliner as well, the Trident. But the 1011 was certified Category 3B Autoland. So in the early 1980s, about 83 or 84, when we started flying the 1011 to Europe, we would fly to London, and typically in the wintertime, the airport's closed at Heathrow because of fog, and everybody's in a holding pattern. 1011 got right in because we required precisely just about zero forward visibility.
Really?
The 1011 would fly the approach, touch down on the runway, lower the nose, reverse the engines, apply the brakes, and come to a full stop without anyone touching the controls.
Wow.
Way ahead of its time. And we'll come back to that when we get out into the hangar here in a bit.
Now, with the engines being problematic, you've mentioned 2 or 3 planes that had problematic engines. Did you guys end up with a lot of crashes, or
Nope.
The pilots were good enough that they were able to fly the 3-engine plane with 2 engines and the 4 with 3?
I can't think of any crash that we had that engine problems were responsible for.
Wow.
We did have our share of fatal crashes through the years, but not because of engine problems. And I'm going to put a plug in for our maintenance staff. I'm not the guy that's an expert on the maintenance part, but I always thought, and many people agree, that our maintenance people were the best in the business. And we'll come back to that in a bit. Unfortunately, that area of the museum is currently under construction. We're not quite sure what it's going to look like yet, but I'll show you a result of some work our mechanics did at the overhaul base, specifically on a Northrop Alpha as we move into the next room.
Okay.
You probably remember the hijacking in 1985 in the Middle East.
Oh, okay.
It stretched on for 21 days. The hijackers had no money, and they also didn't know really where they wanted to end up. And that's the reason that thing dragged on for 21 days and went to multiple countries in the Middle East. By that time, I was a purser based in New York, and Uli Derrickson, the purser on that flight, was a friend of mine. Little known fact, the hijackers had no money, and all of the people on the ground in the Middle East refused to refuel the airplane to continue the extravaganza. Wanted payment in cash. Uli used her personal credit cards to buy thousands of gallons of jet fuel to let the thing continue.
Wow.
This is kind of gruesome. Maybe I shouldn't even mention it, but unfortunately, she was not fast enough in hiding everybody's passports. And the hijackers discovered there was a 21-year-old sailor on board. They strapped him into the forward left jump seat, shot him in the head, opened the door, and dumped the body out on the ramp.
Wow.
The airplane, 4339 was the tail number, came back here to Kansas City, went through overhaul, and then went back into service. We didn't talk too much about its history.
Right.
But I worked it many times after that, and every time I sat in that jump seat, I couldn't not stop and think of that poor guy.
Well, yeah, I'm sure of that.
The adverse publicity, it's typical after a hijacking. You cancel that flight number and you don't operate the flight for a period of time until the publicity dies down. Several months later, I bumped into the general manager of in-flight at Hangar 12 in New York, and he said, we've got an opening for tomorrow that's got your name on it. Or I traded into it. I don't remember how I ended up on it, but the first one that operated after the hijacking, I was the purser. And the airplane was a shuttle between Athens, Rome, and Cairo. And all three of those groups wanted to prove that they weren't responsible for smuggling weapons onto the airplane. So specifically, I remember in Athens, they literally tore the interior apart, ripped out every seat cushion, every life vest, every panel in the lavs, all of the galleys were, just piles of airplane interior in the aisle. And I remember it took us about an hour and a half to put the airplane back together before we could board passengers and actually go anywhere. We landed in Cairo for the first time, and as we're taxiing in, I'm on the forward left jump seat. I could hear the cockpit start laughing behind me, and I called them on the interphone, and I said, what's so funny up there? And they said, you have a bit of a surprise waiting for you when you open the front door. When I did open the front door, about a yard in front of me was the muzzle of a tank.
Oh,
they brought
geez.
a tank up to the front of the airplane with the muzzle pointing inside the front door. And I looked down, and the entire airplane was surrounded by armed soldiers, all with machine guns, pointing at me in the front door.
Wow, aren't you lucky?
Yeah, that was my welcome to Cairo after the first of the hijacking, after the hijacking itself. The seat behind you, before my time, but it's alleged that Amelia Earhart actually sat in this Ford Trimotor seat. Here's a picture of one of her sitting in one just like it. The original seats were wicker in order to save weight on the airplane.
Oh, really?
Yep.
That had to have been comfortable on a long flight.
Well, there were seat cushions on top of the wicker, but it doesn't look very comfortable to me.
No.
Yep.
But to have one that Amelia actually sat in,
This allegedly is the real deal.
that is amazing. That's not a real big seat either.
No. We had some interesting marketing exercises throughout the years. This is one that's, I wouldn't call it a huge success, but it's something we did in 1968. American, United, and TWA all had hourly flights all day, every day between LaGuardia and Chicago.
Okay.
And so someone in our marketing department came up with the scheme that we should brand our flights as Blue Chip Express Service, which to my knowledge meant absolutely nothing. But they made the poor flight attendants wear this particularly nasty looking blue chip dress to work those flights. All the lunch and dinner flights were filet mignon for the entire airplane.
Wow.
And in off meal hours, we had a big sandwich that we gave out chunks of in coach, when ordinarily we wouldn't have a meal. And then there was a cart behind that with a kegger with free beer.
Oh.
Unfortunately, no one anticipated the effects of a New York summer or a Chicago summer on an unrefrigerated commissary truck. And the kegger riding around the airport for 3 or 4 hours before it was boarded on the airplane. So what we actually had on board was pretty much an explosion of foam. This was short-lived, but there's even one worse marketing misjudgment that we'll work our way to as we get around the building.
Okay, now this dress, let me describe it real quick.
Okay.
It's a dress or a uniform that would come down probably mid-thigh, I would assume. It's all white with a collar, 2 little buttons around the waist belt that's just really narrow, like a 3/4 inch or 1/2 inch band. But it has polka dots everywhere. Blue chips, polka dots. So it's a white dress with blue polka dots, and it really looks uniformish in a strange, clownish sort of way.
Fortunately, it was short-lived.
Yes, I'm sure the stewardesses were quite happy.
This is an airplane that never existed.
Oh, really?
Well, the Concorde existed, but not in TWA's livery.
Okay.
We ordered the airplane and allegedly put down substantial payments during pre-construction. But by 1975, when the airplane was finally certified, it was painfully apparent it would not be economically successful, and we canceled the order. But what we did get out of it was a trinket, which is right here in the display case.
Okay.
This little trinket was actually given to our CEO, Charles Tillinghast, by Charles de Gaulle.
Oh.
in thanks for ordering the Concorde in the first place.
Wow.
It looks like we need to get the Tarnex out and possibly clean it up
It's
a
a
bit.
little bit tarnished, yes. But this display case has a lot of the buttons that you probably wore on your uniforms.
Oh, we did. We
and
did.
There's lighters and little chess games, lots of little trinkets that you probably handed out as gifts when people boarded the plane.
That's exactly what we did. These are the things that we gave out to kids.
Okay.
On the airplane.
Okay. And then you got little match books that are really skinny. They're only probably an inch wide.
Well, as a kid traveling on TWA, there were actually cigarettes on my meal tray.
Oh, really?
Everybody had cigarettes on their meal tray, and I suspect you were expected to give them to your parents. I always tried to hide them as quickly as I could and keep them for myself.
It's funny, too, because when I was a child traveling using TWA, I used to use that magic board kit.
Yep.
Really?
Every trip. I loved it. Yeah.
And you said your dad worked for TWA?
Yeah, my dad, Alvin Doherty, he was a mechanic for about 40 years out of the Philadelphia airport, and he was the head mechanic.
And so you got to fly a lot when you were a kid?
Oh, yeah, quite a bit.
Wow. See, I never flew when I was a kid, other than my neighbor took me up in a Cessna, and that was my experience, yeah.
Not just fly first class, $50 anywhere in the world.
That's right.
Really?
To Cairo. I went to Cairo for a three-day weekend, and $50 each way.
Really? But you weren't met with tank?
I don't remember.
Come on around the corner here.
$50 to fly anywhere. Wow.
First class.
First class.
All of this material is navigation equipment from the 40s and the 50s until we got the 747, and all of this in 1970 was replaced by inertial navigation units, which we have here. There were 3 of these in the cockpit of our 747s. Most airlines only had 2, but my understanding is we insisted on 3, and 2 out of the 3 had to agree or we didn't go.
Oh.
But inertial navigation units were so accurate that they were literally programmed from airport to airport, not city to city, and the airplane would make landfall after a transatlantic crossing within 2 miles of where it was expected to be. They were that accurate. The downside, as I understand it, from talking to the cockpit many times, is they programmed these on the ground with the coordinates for the flight, for the navigation coordinates, and then the airplane had to be perfectly still for a short period of time while all the internal gyroscopes stabilized, etc. I remember leaving London with a full load one afternoon, and it was rush hour at Heathrow for departures back to the States. I think we were like number 44 or 45. And it took us about an hour to work our way up to number 2 or 3, and the cockpit started their final pre-takeoff checklist and discovered they had not programmed that.
Uh-oh.
So we turned around, went back to the gate, shut down the engines, and started all over again. And if I remember correctly, several hundred people misconnected in New York because of the delay, because we had not programmed the INS for the flight.
Now, those didn't work off a satellite like GPS. It was radio signal?
They were all internal gyroscopes.
Oh, okay.
And they're still in use today.
Now, the gyroscopes and everything were external and plugged into this little box?
They're
inside the box?
They're in the radio racks in the belly of the airplane.
Okay.
No, they weren't not in the cockpit. But
yeah, because we're looking at a box
unit
here that's
right.
a control box that's 6 inches by 6 inches.
There's a radio rack on a 747 underneath what was the first class cabin, and there was a hatch just inside the 1L door, and mechanics typically would leave that hatch open and go down to work in the radio rack space underneath the cabin. And I got on a 747 at Kennedy one night, and they had left the hatch open, and I almost fell into the radio rack.
Oh!
Lived to tell the tale.
It sounds like you've had some interesting stories.
Not as unfortunate as the poor occupant of this seat. This is the navigator's seat from one of the initial constellations when we started international service in 1946.
So somebody sat in this particular seat all the way across the
All
ocean.
the way across the Atlantic, but there were multiple stops. Typically, the initial routing was New York, LaGuardia, to Gander, to Shannon, to Paris.
Okay, but this chair does not look comfortable at all. It's a steel chair that looks like the old operators' chairs. It looks a lot like the old operator chair.
It does, doesn't it?
And it just does not look like something I'd want to sit in for 4 or 5 hours.
We had one poor navigator who was standing on this chair in the cockpit in 1947, taking a star sighting with a sextant, like what you see here. This is how we navigated then, star sightings across the North Atlantic, through a Perspex bubble in the top of the cockpit, a plastic bubble. The bubble blew out, and it took the navigator with it, and he was never found.
I would imagine that's probably the case, but he was standing on top of the chair.
Yep.
That doesn't look very comfortable.
Right.
Working an instrument that looks like it probably weighs 6 or 7 pounds.
Probably.
Looking through
Yep.
a little bubble in the top of the airplane in order to navigate off the stars.
Yep. That's
That
right.
doesn't sound complicated at all.
All of these are tools that were used by our maintenance staff, the mechanics folks in various cities, as well as at the overhaul base here in Kansas City. I'm not smart enough to know too much about this. All I can say is come back next year and we'll have a much expanded exhibit of what the mechanics were able to do. I can tell you that the overhaul base here in Kansas City was so large that this is how they got around the base. Mechanics rode bicycles with this platform on the front, and they put their tools and parts for the airplane on the front of the bike and rode throughout the overhaul base to get access to various airplanes in different places.
Wow. Now, this is a bicycle that has 2 tires in the front with a cart mounted on top of the 2 tires. It has a handlebar for turning the bicycle. You pedaled it around, and you've got about a 3'6" by 3'6" deck that carried all of your tools. That's interesting.
That's it.
Wow.
We're starting into the in-flight uniforms and a lot of the dining equipment. The original female flight attendant uniform was this one from 1935.
You know, I think I'd have rather wore that one than the polka dot.
Yeah, I think anybody would. Well, we all pretty
you
much...
look pretty professional in that one.
We got a pretty good opportunity to do that because if you look at the very first uniform and the very last uniform, the black one, at the other end of the display case,
Yes.
they're almost the same.
And all the way through.
And there's a reason for that. There's a reason for that, which we'll get to. But the initial food service, we did not have the ability to cook on board, so the food was pre-cooked in these round entree plates, and then on the airplane, it was boarded in these round thermos bottles.
Okay. And we're looking at some thermos bottles that are probably 2 foot tall, big around, probably a foot in diameter or close to it, and super insulated. And so they would cook all of their food prior to, and then put it in these, and then get it out on the flight.
Probably the most notorious uniform was the cutout from 1945, which lasted into, I believe, the early 1950s. In those days, of course, everybody smoked.
Right.
But it was a fireable offense. You could be fired on the spot for smoking in uniform.
Oh, really?
But leave it to a smart aleck flight attendant who figured out that if you unbutton the lapel and fold the flap over the company name, technically you're out of uniform and then you could smoke. Which is what they did. The uniforms got progressively more sophisticated through the years. We used a variety of European fashion designers, Pierre Balmain, Valentino, and others. And there were both winter and summer uniforms. But we still really lacked the ability to cook on board until we got the 707. And the first Nordskog ovens on the 707, at least on the North Atlantic, permitted a full 7-course gourmet meal service, starting with champagne, caviar, and lobster.
Wow.
And ending with fruit and cheese and a big bottle of port as you cross the Atlantic. And to support that on the 707, this is how we would set your first-class tray table.
Wow.
You won't see that anymore.
No, and we're looking at real China with I'm assuming that's a TWA red stripe gold star logo.
This was our Royal Ambassador Service, and the China is from Rosenthal, the German China company.
Okay, and we've got pitchers and glasses and silverware and plates, saucers. Everything right there.
Yep.
That is it's a very nice presentation, and there's your 2 or 3 pack cigarette.
Absolutely. This was the North Atlantic China service, and because we had 2 around the world flights at the time, in the Pacific, the China service was completely different.
Okay, and it looks a little bit more flowery, maybe Japanese-ish.
Looks very oriental, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And you've got your little oriental spoon that you see at the Chinese buffet to eat your soup with.
There was a stop in Bangkok on the Around the World service, and the staffers in Bangkok would always line the entire first-class lounge area, which was a 4-seat area opposite the galley. They would line that with orchids.
Oh, really?
It looked like a huge greenhouse. And every place setting, when we set the tables for the meal service, there was an orchid placed on every tray table along with the service.
Really?
Yep.
This is an amazing display of the silverware, the thermoses that you used. You've got a basket that has a tea kettle in it with 2 little teacups for your oriental tea, along with a little fan. Just amazing. I mean, this is really high class, first class, whatever you want to say.
First class. What can I
First
say?
class.
When I
Nothing
started,
like what you get now.
right,
A bag of peanuts.
or pretzels.
Okay. You got your choice.
When I started in 1973, the idea of a male flight attendant was so new that they didn't have a uniform for us. So they put us in the cockpit uniform. We were dressed like the pilots, but we only had 1 stripe on our sleeve instead of the 2 stripes that a flight engineer would have, or the 4 stripes that a captain would have. Until in 1974, the first male flight attendant uniform was this, the only thing I know to call it is kind of a leisure suit looking thing.
Right. It looks like a military
It does. It
uniform coat.
There is 1 remaining picture of me out there somewhere with that uniform, and trust me, no one will ever see it.
It's better than you having to wear the dress because
exactly.
they didn't have a male uniform.
And the women were dressed in a similar fashion, complete with safari hats that went with it.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
That's a cool looking hat, but yeah. And how long did it take to fly across the Atlantic?
Depending on the time of year, and depending on which direction, because eastbound is typically about 45 minutes shorter than westbound.
Okay.
Because of headwinds coming west. And New York to London, I think I've made that in, under 6 hours. Whereas I can remember some really strong headwind days flying from, say, Milan or Rome or Athens back to New York that stretched up to 10 and a half, 11 hours.
So the meal on the flight was definitely a must-have thing.
Typically, we tried to, especially eastbound, because people wanted to sleep, we tried to make it fast. But for a full load on a 747, there's no way you could finish that meal service in less than 2 hours and 45 minutes.
Wow.
Typically, it took 3 hours, depending on how fast the galley person on the 747 was. But if you add takeoff and landing, sitting in your jump seat time, a 3-hour meal service, a 2-hour movie, 90 minutes to serve breakfast before you land, and a duty-free service, you're going to come up with a negative number as far as how much time you have left. So in truth, a lot of this all happened at the same time. We were selling duty-free during the movie when we started the breakfast in order to get everything done. So there was never a moment to stop. In 1979, we hired Ralph Loren to design the next uniform. And he worked with a group of TWA volunteer employees, and the approved design was a beautiful charcoal gray 3-piece vested suit for both men and women, and a hunter green summer uniform. They had literally spent millions of dollars on buying the fabric, and they were already having Hart, Schaffner, and Marks manufacture uniforms. When again, somebody from our marketing department said we should show this to our top 100 accounts to make sure that they really like it. They hated it.
Ooh.
And we asked them why they hated it. And they said, because in that uniform, you look just like we do. We don't want you to look like us. We want you to look like you work here. So we told Ralph Loren, sorry, but we're scrapping that uniform. And allegedly, he said, well, what do you want? And we told him something more uniform. We told him toward the end of a week, and he said, I'll get to work on it through the weekend. And the uniform that we quickly resulted in was nowhere near what he originally designed. He ended up with that.
Which looks a lot like the very
first one. And if you look at that and the very first one, they're almost exactly the same.
Wow.
And in fact, there was
what a mistake for the echelons, I
no
guess.
Comment.
I mean.
No comment.
And what a slam to your workers.
Yeah.
What can I say? We were pretty upset, but we weren't consulted.
Right.
Yeah. So we all wore that uniform, and in fact, there was a summer uniform, which was the exact same color as the original, the Air Force Blue.
Okay.
But eventually that was phased out. If you turn around, the model of the 747 here, unlike most airlines, and I'm getting way down in the weeds here, we would rebid our working positions every leg. Most airlines, cabin crew anyway, would bid their work position by the month. You work this position for a month, and then you have a completely different schedule and a completely different work position. But we would bid one way over the Atlantic, and then we'd have a briefing in Europe and bid for the return trip. And a lot of people use that to their, I shouldn't say a lot, but some people use that to their advantage to try to figure out where the least number of people would be. And then they would bid to work that area coming back. I called that load hopping, which some people didn't appreciate. But I knew, because I was always junior on the crew, I didn't have to bother to bid because I would be right here.
Okay.
The
right in the
left
back.
side of E-zone and the back of a 747, because that flight attendant waited on more people than any other person on the airplane.
Wow.
And after 2 years, I was finally able to move from the left side of E-zone to the right side of E-zone, which was a big deal because there was one fewer seat in every row, meaning you had a whole lot fewer people to wait on. And then somebody said, idiot, why don't you just take the language exams and become a purser? The purser position on the North Atlantic only worked the first class aisle. So I traded all of that in for carving the Chateaubriand in first class.
Wow.
And that was the best job in the world. So, of course, in 1986, they eliminated the position.
Oh.
Oh, well.
Now, when did TWA go out of business?
2001.
2001.
Yep.
Okay.
Yet another interesting uniform saga is the paper dress. Someone from our advertising agency said, you know what? American and United have flights that compete with you from New York to the West Coast. But you're an international airline, so you should differentiate your flights from everybody else. And the answer to that question was, that nobody asked, by the way, was foreign accent flights. There were 4 foreign accents. Depending upon which foreign accent your flight was designated, the flight attendants ended up having to wear one of these wear once and throw away paper uniforms to work the flight. There was, for instance, the Roman toga, the Manhattan penthouse, the English serving wench, and they really were paper, and we were promised that the paper was fireproof, but we very quickly discovered that the ink in the paper was not fireproof. And in those days, you could still smoke on airplanes, and we actually had some flight attendants that were burned by careless smokers.
Really?
No self-respecting flight attendant that summer came to work without a stapler, a roll of Scotch tape, and scissors to get herself into the uniform, because this was before the mails. And they were deeply appreciative when this program died a quick death after only 3 months in 1968.
Okay, but what happens if they spilled water or something on them while they were, I mean, yeah, I've heard of contests where they wet T-shirts and stuff, but I would imagine that a wet paper uniform would just kind of disintegrate.
Not going there.
I probably shouldn't bring stuff like this up. You guys are laughing
You
too
wouldn't
hard.
heard about that.
Yeah.
I've never heard a positive comment about the paper dressing
I'll
room.
bet you haven't.
Yeah.
I'm just
Behind
kind of appalled or amazed or something here with the whole concept.
Behind
Aluminum
you,
ones look like something out of a 1970s sci-fi film.
Yeah.
this is a really nice model of the initial configuration of the L-1011 when we finally received it in 1972. The initial configuration had really nice, roomy coach seats that were only 8 abreast. They were quickly replaced with 9 abreast. And there was initially a 16-seat coach lounge, complete with a stand-up bar. So I mentioned that as a junior crew member, I was always in the back of E-Zone on the 747. The junior position on this airplane quickly became the lounge, because after the seatbelt sign went off, everybody would run to the lounge and then stay for the duration of the flight. So this poor person never got a break. You had a full house the entire time. The first class cabin had a 4-seat first class lounge, and the seats in the center swiveled 360 degrees. And you can see a small cocktail table between each row. We could pull up on the cocktail table and stick a pin in the base, and then we carried 4 48-inch tabletops, which fit on top of that cocktail table. You would swivel those center seats around, and you had a perfect table for 4. We even had tablecloths that perfectly fit that round table for 4. It didn't happen often, but occasionally we'd be in the middle of the service with all that fancy china you see over there, and somebody would accidentally kick the latch and the cotter pin in the base, and the whole thing would crash to the floor. The 1011 was interesting for another reason as well. We had always a choice of 5 entrees in the front and 3 entrees in the back. So unlike the pretzels of today, everyone on the airplane was guaranteed their first choice. And the way we did that was we took orders on the ground for what everybody wanted for dinner, and then we actually carried a huge amount of frozen food, and we defrosted frozen food to make sure that everybody got their first choice. And the 1011 was totally different from every other airplane in that 1 person and 1 assistant worked downstairs underneath the cabin to make all of that happen.
You have a full kitchen underneath there.
You have ovens, freezers, refrigerators, and all the food was defrosted, cooked, and then put into those carts. And then the food went up in galley elevators, galley lifts, and then it was distributed to the various cabins on the airplane.
Wow.
A lot of flight attendants that had been flying for some time were kind of scared of working down here because 1 person was pretty much responsible for the entire food service on the airplane. So that became my new home away from home. I worked down there for a couple of years, which was fabulous because you would sit here for takeoff in the tail.
Right.
Then you'd go downstairs and literally work the entire flight downstairs and never came upstairs until you came up to sit in the same seat for landing. So I never even saw the passengers and they never saw me, which was great. And if you look at the model right behind you, if you worked downstairs, you even had your own personal window.
Oh.
Right there.
Well, now, how do you guys deal with the turbulence and some of that kind of stuff? You've got your table, your setting, you've got all your chinaware, and when I've taken flights, sometimes there's enough turbulence that you would think that that stuff would kind of bounce off.
You do suspend the meal service typically, and if it's really bad, typically the cockpit crew, for our safety, would ask the cabin crew to sit down, and you just kind of hold on and hope for the best. But in truth, in 27 years of flying, I can't remember more than 2 or 3 times that we really had to suspend the service for any length of time.
And even walking around down in the galley taking food from stoves to sinks or whatever.
You can't see them here, but on either side of the elevators downstairs were rough air seats with shoulder harnesses.
Okay.
So if it got really bumpy, you just sat down. They were supposed to never be occupied for takeoff and landing, but during the flight, if it got bumpy, you just sat down.
Okay. Now, I got another question
Sure.
that just as a general question. Back when I was a kid in the 70s, we used to be playing outside and we would hear sonic booms all the time. Haven't heard one in many years. Actually, I guess I can't say that. I was just near an Air Force base this winter and I heard a couple of sonic booms,
Sure.
but that was the first I'd heard in probably 20 years. These planes were capable of flying above Mach 1, right?
None of our airplanes.
None of your, so it wasn't the commercial airplanes that
No.
were making the sonic
No,
booms?
never,
Only one
except
was
for the Concorde.
Okay.
And it was forbidden to fly over land for that very reason.
Okay.
It could only, that alone made it economically unfeasible. You couldn't operate the airplane over land.
Okay. Well, I didn't ever know what kind of planes were making them, but I know that back in the 70s you heard sonic booms
Not
quite
guilty,
often.
not us.
Well, I wasn't blaming anybody. I was just curious. They did outlaw it at some point in time, correct?
It was a different airline.
I mentioned the Northrop Alpha, the mail plane.
Right.
Someone contacted us in the 1970s and said, you know what, we think we found one of your original Northrop Alphas in a barn in Wisconsin. And we sent some people up to look at it, and there's what we found.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Okay, now we're looking at a wall with a bunch of pictures of a fuselage, some dislodged wings, and it looks like you're in the restoration process.
Well, we brought it down here to Kansas City, and the mechanics, again, our mechanics were, I think, the best in the business. They started cleaning it up, and the more they got into it, they realized that there was no way to restore this airplane without actually making new parts for the airplane. And to their credit, our mechanics volunteered literally thousands of hours to refabricate parts and rebuild the airplane by hand. You can see it with the 747 in the background here in Kansas City. Here it is in the reconstruction process. And when they finished, here's what we had.
Wow.
And there's where you see it today. It's hanging in the Air and Space Museum on the Mall in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
That gallery has been closed for about 3 years as they rebuild the museum, but just in the last 3 months or so, it reopened.
Okay.
And you can see the airplane there today. And oh, by the way, there's the forbidden United 247 hanging right behind it.
Okay, explain why it's forbidden.
Well, because we weren't allowed to buy it.
Oh,
in the
okay,
1930s.
gotcha. The United plane.
Okay, now I'm going to repeat what is a story that's allegedly true. I can't prove it. But our eccentric owner, Howard Hughes, treated TWA's fleet as his personal toys, pretty much. The airplanes were not owned by TWA. They were owned by Hughes Tool Company.
Okay.
And leased back. He thought nothing of calling crew scheduling in the middle of the night in Los Angeles and saying, get a company flight engineer out of bed. I don't want a first officer. And literally taking an airplane and disappearing with it for weeks on end. I flew early in my career with a flight engineer who was getting close to retirement. He was on one of those extravaganzas with Howard Hughes that lasted 3.5 weeks.
Wow.
And he had no idea day to day where he was going. Hughes allegedly flew into Kansas City around midnight on a Saturday night, and the manifest said there were only 3 people on board that Constellation, Howard Hughes, captain, a company flight engineer, and 1 passenger, Cary Grant. They asked that the airplane be refueled, and Hughes filed a flight plan from here to Dallas. Somewhere en route, he changed his mind and didn't bother to cancel the flight plan, and flew the airplane down into Mexico and didn't tell anybody where he was. So for a short period of time, we had no idea where Howard Hughes was, or where Cary Grant was, or where our employee was.
That was kind of Howard Hughes's MO, though, wasn't it? He
It
was
was.
He was running pretty hard from the IRS, from what I understand.
Not in those
And-
days. I
Not
don't
in those
think.
days.
Yeah.
But
That came later.
Okay, well, he was very good at disappearing. They chased him for what, 30 years, and weren't ever able to get him.
When the first Constellation was completed, the first production Connie was completed during World War II, it also was immediately confiscated for the war effort, and allegedly Howard Hughes was not amused by that. But he said, if they're taking my airplane, then I will deliver it in person, and I will set a new coast-to-coast speed record in the process. And he did. 6 hours and 47 minutes from Burbank, California to Washington National. And if you look closely in the upper right-hand corner, this is the original navigation log from that flight. You can see listed is co-captains Howard Hughes and Jack Fry. Jack Fry was our CEO.
Right.
And these are the navigation waypoints as they cross the country on that delivery flight.
Wow. And the original.
Mm-hmm.
That is so cool. So you have a simulator over here.
We do.
Is
It's
that for people to try out,
try
or
their skill? And I'll warn you, I'm a pilot myself, and if you can fly this, you can actually fly the airplane. This is harder.
really?
Yeah, this is more skittish than the actual airplane itself. But we let people take a shot at keeping the blue side up and the brown side down, as they say.
Well, I might have to give that a try when we're done.
We can probably arrange for that to
A
happen.
pretty good hands-on experience there.
We have always had a very strong relationship with the Vatican. And traditionally, whenever a pope visited the United States for many years, they flew Alitalia one way and TWA the other way.
Oh, really?
I was never considered to be a crew member on a papal charter because I'm not a good Catholic boy. And it was always a very politicized process. I was involved in the logistics for planning one of them, but on a 747 at least, we would take everything out of the upper deck and put a big bed upstairs for the Pope and a conference table and chairs and a big closet for his clothes. First class was full of Vatican officials who, shouldn't say this, but ate and drank themselves under the table. And the entire rest of the airplane was traveling press. And
Okay.
we charged an arm and a leg for a press member to ride the papal charter. So we always made the guarantee that no matter where they sat on the airplane, they got the full transatlantic meal service, which was a logistical nightmare because a 747 is designed to support 21 first-class passengers, and now we're providing that same level of service for 368.
Wow.
The Pope, at least Pope John Paul II, was a really regular guy. Friends of mine did work several papal charters. He would always invite each crew member upstairs individually to sit and talk with him, pose for photographs, etc.
Wow.
And oddly enough, almost never touched the food.
Really?
Nope, almost never ate. But had he chosen to, he'd have eaten very well. This is the menu from one of his transatlantic charters. And as you can see, it's pretty sophisticated.
Oh, yeah. Wow. Lamb roast, lobster thermidor,
You bet.
rice pilaf. I don't know how to say all these fancy names. It's way fancier than I eat. Smoked salmon, Parma ham, smoked turkey. Wow.
Around the corner, a space we've set aside to remember not just the folks that we lost on Flight 800, the 747 off the coast of Long Island in New York.
That was just somewhat recently.
In the late 1990s.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
The alleged cause of the accident was a spark in a fuel tank.
Right.
Personal opinion, I don't believe that for a second.
Neither do a whole lot of conspiracy theorists. I'm in the same boat with them.
Well, then you're in good company with a retired naval admiral and aviation investigator who's come up with this alternative theory, which is many hundreds of pages long and particularly gruesome reading. But his theory is that it was indeed shot down by a surface-to-air missile. I believe that.
Let me go into conspiracy here just for a minute because
Go
I
right
can.
ahead.
Okay, when the Twin Towers fell, Stephanopoulos was interviewed on TV, and he said that this comes in a long line of incidences that have happened, and he named Flight 800, he named the Cole ship bombing, he named a whole bunch of them, and that quote cannot be found again. I was watching the news when he said that, and after that, that quote has been totally wiped clear, and it's not there. So he believed at the time that it was part of a long string of terrorist events,
Well,
but yet it's
friends of
been
mine,
recanted.
who were at our, actually, a safety instructor at our training center in St. Louis, and her husband, who was a policeman, they were so convinced it was shot down that they allegedly were able to obtain a piece of upholstery from the cabin, which they alleged showed missile fuel residue on it. They were pursued to the ends of the earth by the FBI and various authorities, and they were actually charged with theft of government property. Now I'm really giving myself away.
That's okay.
A friend of mine was hiding them in her apartment here in Kansas City on the Country Club Plaza, and I knew where they were. Well, the FBI was in hot pursuit. But we won't go there.
We won't go there. No. There's a lot of places not to go, but
I will say that we want to remember here not just the people on 800, but all the lives that have been lost on all of our accidents through the years. And fortunately, they've been few and far between. But we have put together a brief biography on every single person on board Flight 800, not just our crew members. And again, all of this is available. You're free to come back and take a look at this on your own time if you want.
okay.
On the wall behind you are the crew members that were on board the airplane.
Okay.
And the reason there's so many of them is there were 2 complete crews on board, one working the flight and one deadheading on the flight. They were to protect it on from Paris to Rome. Again, I was living in New York at the time, and I had flown with many of these people multiple times. I'll tell one war story, and I shouldn't, but she would laugh along with us if she could. My friend Debbie DeLuccio here.
Okay.
That's her married name. I knew her before she got married. She was a bit of a Southern belle from Atlanta, complete with a Southern drawl. And she met an Italian school teacher on a Rome flight, married the guy, and moved to Agropoli, Italy.
Okay.
She had 3 beautiful children that I was able to meet on multiple times when they traveled on passes. And after having those children, she decided she wanted to come back to flying. So she figured out a way she could commute from Agropoli, Italy to New York for work. She would get up at 2 o'clock in the morning, take the first flight of the day the first train of the day from Agropoli to downtown Rome, transfer to the airport. In civilian clothes, she would climb on our 841, the nonstop to New York, with us before the passengers got there. And her deal was she would break into one of the coach bar carts back in the tail, where I always ended up having to work, and she would chug 2 splits of Coach white wine, and then climb into the aft right coat compartment, way back in the tail, way back here. And then she would try to take a nap on top of the dirty headsets we stored in that closet, all the way to New York. That was her standard way to commute, and it was perfectly legal because it was way more than 12 hours before she was reporting for work. And I was standing in the galley one day, and an irate passenger stormed in and said, "There's a drunk passed out on my garment." And I knew, of course, it was Debbie. And just then she walked into the galley and said, "I need a couple more white wines, Larry. That didn't knock me out." You just can't make that stuff up.
Nope, there's a drunk in the back.
And were she here today, she'd laugh along with us. We're going to go out in the hangar now.
Okay. This has all been so fascinating.
This was the original TWA hangar in the 1930s, and we have pictures of it just chock-a-block full of DC-3s in here.
This is a big hangar.
Howard Hughes always kept an office here in Kansas City whenever he'd come to visit. And allegedly, those 2 windows on the far side are where he kept his office because he wanted to keep an eye on everything going on in the hangar.
Wow.
Pardon the mess because they're doing work on the roof, which is knocking down about 5 years of dust, I think. But I showed you the model of the Lockheed Electra.
Right.
This is the actual airplane.
Wow.
We operated a fleet of exactly 1 in the 1940s, early 1940s, but we never carried any passengers with it. This was our quote-unquote flying research laboratory. This airplane was flown by Amelia Earhart and Charles Lindbergh and Chuck Yeager.
Really?
This is the airplane.
This one right here?
This one right here.
Wow.
And
what kind of research did they do?
They did research into flying at night,
Okay.
radio navigation, instrument flying, icing on airframes,
Okay.
how to wick off and absorb lightning strikes, all kinds of things like that.
Wow.
The airplane was, I can open it if you want. You're welcome to peek in.
I would love to peek in.
Yep.
Wow, you've got 4 seats in the back. You got the pilot and the co-pilot. a little storage area back here, baggage capacity 220 pounds. It's a nice compartment in here with, it's all carpeted and
Oh, yeah.
And,
The airplane was,
it's-
here, you know what I'm going to do? Hold on. This should have been put up this morning.
I would have thought for a research plane, it would have been pretty much bare bones, but this thing looks pretty comfortable to have flown in. And so did they have a lot of flight instruments and stuff in here also, or?
Actually, it's pretty much, if you're a pilot, the basic T of the instrument configuration for most every airplane.
Okay.
And I'll show you the basic T when we get around on the other side of it. But the airplane was owned by one of our CEOs in the 1930s, a guy named Paul Richter. He left the airplane to his daughter, and she maintained it for many, many years out in California. She contacted us 4 or 5 years ago and said, I'd really like the museum to have it on the condition that you hangar it. So we've agreed that we'll keep it hangared here.
Right.
She flew it in herself. She made a low pass over the field, got the traditional fire engine water welcome
Wow.
as she taxied up, and here she is when she got here to the building. She's in her 80s,
Really?
and she's quite a remarkable woman. She's fascinating to talk to.
That is so cool. So do you take this out on
We do
flights
not.
ever? Or?
Never.
So the last flight
It
was
is
when it was
allegedly
hangared.
airworthy. I'm not going to be the one to find out.
Okay.
If you come around the corner here, by the way, lightning strike protection, it's as simple as this.
Really?
Yep.
Okay, what he's hanging on to is a little string, I guess is what you'd call it.
Typically, I think initially they were probably copper wires. I'm not sure of that.
Okay.
And the lightning travels through the metal and wicks off of the airplane there.
Okay. And this just looks like braided number 10 wire is what it looks like.
And this
It's
is
about
state of
6
the art.
inches long.
You'll find these all over every airplane today.
Wow. I wonder how long it took them to figure that one out.
I don't know.
It's almost like a grounding rod, all except it just kind of goes out into the ether instead of into the ground.
One of the things we worked on was flying on instruments, and this is how we train people to do that.
Okay. And this is World War II era?
This is 1930s, World War II. During the war, we trained, the sign says, 500,000 pilots were trained on this. This thing moved in every axis, and you sit in there, and this is where the term under the hood comes from, because when we lower the hood, you're sitting in pitch black in there, and if you know anything about instrument flying, the first thing you're taught to do is completely disregard what your senses are telling you.
Okay.
Because within less than a minute, your inner ear will say you're straight and level, even if you're upside down.
Oh, really?
So you disregard whatever you think you're doing, and you only rely upon what you see on the instrument panel there.
Okay.
Amelia Earhart was trained to fly on instruments on something similar to this.
Okay. Now, we just did a podcast at the WASP Museum, which is the Women Air Force Service,
Yep.
in Sweetwater, Texas. And they had one of these simulators there also. And she was talking about how it would move all kinds of different directions, up, down, and
Yeah.
That'd be so cool to play with.
You want, it's not affiliated with TWA, you want my Chuck Yeager story?
Sure. I'll take any story I can get.
When I retired in 2000, I went to work for the parent corporation of AeroTrader magazine and website.
Okay.
And somehow I was able to convince them that when we were exhibitors at Oshkosh at the Experimental Aircraft Association every year, I said, you really shouldn't send anybody to Oshkosh who's not a pilot. And I am a pilot. So they said, all right, fine, you'll be our designee for Oshkosh. And because we were exhibitors, we were able to stay at the Hilton on the property, on the airport,
Okay.
where all the big names stay. And the first night I got there, I got in the elevator with Chuck Yeager. And he stuck his hand out and said, hi, I'm Chuck Yeager. I said, yeah, I know. And he laughed and said, yeah, I already knew that you knew. We actually ended up sharing a cab back to Appleton after the show.
Really?
But Chuck Yeager was there. Bob Hoover, the famous stunt pilot, was there. My next door neighbor was Cliff Robertson, the actor, who's also a pilot. Quite an interesting experience.
I'll bet.
There's more to show
Now,
you.
is Oshkosh still a big thing?
Oh
or-
yeah, about 600,000 or 700,000 people every July.
I know Paul Harvey always used to talk about Oshkosh. It
It's
seemed
amazing.
every year he'd have something going on. I ought to try and get there sometime.
Yo, you really, if you haven't ever done it, you should.
Now, did TWA run other flights besides passenger and mail, or?
We had a dedicated group of freighters.
Okay, so you were hauling freight also?
Mm-hmm. One of the employee benefits back when I started in the 70s, you could import one car from Europe a year. And
Really?
they put it on the freighter.
Wow.
Yeah. So a lot of people would buy Mercedes or BMWs and ship it back to the States.
Right. Wow. That's pretty good benefit.
That didn't last very long.
Oh. Okay, wow, this is a cool room. Okay, I just walked into a room that has, it looks like the cockpit of a 707. It's got the seats out of what kind of a plane here?
These originally were in 727.
727. And they're the reclining airplane seats like what you'd see. Lots of instrumentation. This room is just amazing, and I'm sure we're going to find out what all this stuff is.
Back in the 1970s, my original intent was to be a pilot, not a flight attendant. And I already had a commercial license and an instrument rating and all of that. And every time I'd talk to flight ops, they'd just laugh and say, "We'll never talk to you. And you'll never guess the reason."
Tell me the reason.
Because I'm 5'7". And in those days, every pilot had to be at least 5'8".
Really? So you missed it by an inch.
An inch.
So size does matter.
They finally got over that in the 1990s, and today I see United captains that come up to about here on me.
Really?
But there was a time in the 1960s we were so desperately short of pilots that we actually hired people off the street.
Off of the street.
Off the street, no flying experience of any kind. And this is how we trained them. They would not immediately be captains on 707s. They were trained to become flight engineers on the 707s with no flying experience. And they would sit in class all day. These from the 1960s still work. I'll lower the landing gear here. And it'll come down.
Okay, so he's got a screen that will show you what the levers are that you pulled. So he just pulled the landing gear down. And over here I'm watching the screen that's just got yellow landing gear. It's on a black background, and the landing gear just folded down.
So these are all the systems that flight engineers monitored on a 707. And the instructor from here could fail different components of all of these systems, and you would essentially have to nut out how to keep the airplane flying.
Really?
Once you figured all of that out, then you moved from the training boards
Why wasn't I on the street then?
into
I would have loved this.
a cockpit procedure trainer.
Okay.
This is a 707 cockpit, and all of those systems you see on the wall over there on the airplane reduced to that.
Really?
Yep.
Okay, now we're looking at a wall that has the screens and all the panels, and we're talking about probably 18 feet of length, 4 feet high, and now I'm looking at a panel that is probably 3 foot wide and a total of about 4 foot tall. And so all of that is right there.
Right there. Now you add a captain and a first officer, and the instructor sat here and could fail all these different systems, and now you have to work as a 3-member crew to figure out how to keep the airplane flying. This was a gift from the Air Force. We have a long-term relationship with the Air Force. We used to do the pilot training for Air Force One.
Okay.
This is a 707. We had an identical one for the Convair 880. Somehow, our Convair 880 cockpit procedure trainer ended up in the Delta Museum in Atlanta.
Okay.
Which, if you've never been there,
I have not been there.
You've got to do that.
Wow.
Delta had one L1011 cockpit procedure trainer. It's right here.
So you guys swapped trainers?
No, we didn't. They gave it to somebody else down there who ran into financial trouble, and they said, take it off our hands.
Oh, how unfortunate.
Yeah, so here it is. This is Delta's L-1011.
Wow.
I have a neighbor here in Kansas City who wanted to come through the museum, and I brought him down, and he said, well, I never told you this, but my dad's a retired Delta L-1011 captain. And I said, well, call him up. Let's start a FaceTime call. Show him this bad boy. And we did, and his dad got all choked up when he saw this.
Really?
He'd spent many hours in this thing learning the systems on the L-1011.
Well, I'm sure there was many hours trying to figure. I mean, there's so much instrumentation, buttons, levers, switches, that just trying to figure out which one's which without having to look down and read or go to the manual would be pretty.
1011, by the way, was the last 3-pilot airplane.
3-pilot.
No more flight engineer.
Oh, really?
Yeah, no more flight engineer. And if you come around the corner to the MD-88 here, this is still a work in progress, so excuse the holes in the instrument panel, but all of the flight engineer functions are up here.
Okay. Right above, right between the seats.
Yep. And these are functions that are typically automated today, so there's very little reason to do much with this.
Okay. Now, you talked earlier about one of the planes that had an automatic land feature. Mm-hmm. Is that now standard procedure on all of these planes, or what?
Alien dog.
Oh, somebody's pooch just showed up.
Yeah.
Huh. Okay.
That's pretty much every airplane today. All airliners can do that. Yeah.
Okay.
But bear in mind, this was 1972.
Right.
Now I'm really going to go off the rails here.
Okay.
We just changed the video, but until a couple of weeks ago, this was a training video that I had to sit through multiple times in the 1970s of wet ditching a 747 in the North Atlantic. And we actually filmed the wet ditch part in the Gulf of Mexico using real rafts and real crew members and all of that.
The water's warmer.
Yeah, yeah. Well, in training, we all had to jump in and out of a swimming pool fully dressed about 30 or 40 times, and then climb in and out of the life rafts, which are actually very tippy and easy to upset and all of that. I'm a smart aleck in class that asked the instructor what kind of food provisions we put into the rafts. And he laughed and said, absolutely nothing. He said, because if you're in that raft for more than 6 hours, the least of your problems are what's for dinner. He said, but, and this is only what I was told, I have no way to prove it. He said, apparently there's an engineer with a sense of humor, because allegedly every raft on every airplane has one food item. A package of lifesavers.
Oh, really?
That's funny.
I guess that's what you need at that time. Now, I got another question going back to some stuff that we talked about earlier. You were talking about the height requirements for pilots.
Right.
But there was some pretty strict height and size and weight requirements for the stewardesses, too.
Yeah. They were perpetually fighting weight. And in fact, they could be hauled into the office at any time and weighed. And if they were over what they were supposed to be, they were taken off the payroll.
Now, what they were supposed to be was like, what, 110 pounds or something?
It varied depending on height.
Oh, depended on height.
Yeah.
But they couldn't be over a certain height either, correct?
In the night, yeah, they couldn't be. But the height requirement was never a problem. It was 6 feet.
Oh.
And the reason for the 6-foot height requirement? The down galley on the 1011 was exactly 6 feet tall.
Okay.
Otherwise you'd be banging your head into the ceiling down there all the time.
Huh. Okay. And
we had multiple flight attendant domiciles, and unlike the pilots, they're only certified on one airplane at a time. If you're a 1011 captain, you only fly the 1011. If you only fly the 747, then that's your airplane. The flight attendants had to be qualified on everything. So with multiple domiciles, we had to maintain emergency evacuation door trainers and all of that in a bunch of different cities. So somehow, the FAA approved a 2x4 and plywood back door for an MD-80 here This was in Los Angeles in our hangar out there for the West Coast flight attendants to have to recertify every year on the MD-80. On the actual airplane, when you get on the airplane, if I open the door using this handle, then a set of stairs comes down out of the ceiling and lowers to the ground, and then you can send people down the stairs onto the ramp without having to have a jetway up to the airplane. When you hear the announcement, prepare the aircraft for departure, the flight attendant in this position just drops this flap. That's it. Now I've covered up that door handle and I've uncovered this door handle. And if I pull that door handle instead, the entire tail cone falls off the airplane and rolls away, leaving a gaping hole in the back. The stairs fly up into the ceiling, and an escape slide shoots out of the back, auto-inflates in 12 seconds or less, and now you have an emergency way out of the airplane. And we know it works because one of our mechanics at the overhaul base pulled the wrong handle in the middle of the night and dropped a tail cone on the hangar floor.
On the hangar floor, but this wasn't mid-flight.
No, this was,
I'm kind of going,
this was in the overhaul base in the hangar.
wow. But it seems like it could have been a situation, as easy as this thing is to pull apart, as far as where the handles are and everything, that a mid-flight tail removal.
Well, another nonprofit group owns an MD-80 that used to be operated by us. And typically in the summertime, they park it right outside the door, and we let people walk through it. It's a fully functioning airplane. So when we let people just walk through the airplane, and I'm the one that's guiding the tours, this is how I am with the back door. Because
Standing up against it so nobody can touch
I'm not
a
going to be the
handle.
one to let somebody touch that.
Right.
That'd be so bad.
Wow. This is such an amazing place. I thought this was going to be a little quick, not much here museum, but this place, you could spend hours looking at all the different pieces of equipment and flight simulators and everything else.
This is the front half of a 707 first class galley. The back half is exactly like it and was right about here. And the galley service door, where the food was boarded, is right where you're standing. Out of here, we managed to pull off a 7-course transatlantic meal service for 16 people. I personally dreaded working breakfast flights on a 707 because in those days we always had 5 entree choices, and one of the 5 choices was always Eggs Benedict. For Eggs Benedict on the 707, as a non-rev, you probably had them. Foil pans of Canadian bacon, English muffins, poached eggs, asparagus spears, hollandaise sauce, black olives, all in this oven. Except things never work the way they're supposed to. If you got the Canadian bacon hot, the poached eggs would always explode. So the first thing we do is take the poached eggs out of the oven and stick them in the bun warmer with the coffee cake and just forget about them. And that kept them the perfect temperature. If you got the Canadian bacon hot, the hollandaise sauce would curdle and turn black.
Ooh.
So we take the hollandaise sauce out of the oven and put it into a coffee pot and stick it in the coffee maker.
Now we're looking at, when he says they prepared a full meal, this is the height of the cabin of the airplane. And it's only about 4.5 feet wide. It's got a little oven that is probably 24 inches by 24 inches that had all of the shelves in it that he was talking about. This is really a small, super small kitchen that they're trying to work out of to serve breakfast, lunch, dinner, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And there's no space for anything. Your camp trailer's got bigger galley than what this is.
Frozen food was boarded in carriers like this. These would be packed with dry ice and frozen entrees.
Wow. And again, that's not that much. That's another 24 by 24 inch area that's probably 24 inches deep.
One of these days, I'm trying to get the museum to get the other half of a first class galley, and then we'll set up all the aisle serving carts as an exhibit with all the different courses.
And there's no room to move.
No room to move.
No, you can barely turn around between the two.
Oh yeah.
Wow. This is just...
On a 727 regular, you had just one galley like this for both first class and coach. So in this little space right here, you were constantly bumping asses with the coach flight attendant if you were working first class, because you were sharing this.
That is
Pardon my language.
incredible. That is just amazing.
A blast from the past.
Oh, yeah.
Ashtrays on the armrest.
And nobody celebrated the ban on smoking on airplanes more than the flight attendant group.
Oh, I'm sure.
I could stand in the front of a 747 and look toward the back in the smoking days, and you could only see about halfway. About halfway, it'd just be an enormous blue cloud.
And the biggest joke of all time at that time was the non-smoking section.
Yeah.
You're sitting right next to the guy, he's one seat ahead of you, and the minute the little light goes off ahead, the lighter is ready to go, and click, off he goes.
This is smoking, and this is non-smoking.
Yeah.
Yeah. One aisle behind.
Yeah.
But, you know, restaurants were that way too. You had the no
Oh, yeah.
smoking section, and the table right next to you was in the smoking section.
I remember the first summer it was banned, and we had a lot of European passengers that insisted they smoke wherever they want.
Wow.
So it was a challenge.
But, you know, back in the day, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, maybe even into the 90s, smoking was what everybody did.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it was, if you didn't smoke, you were an anomaly.
We're probably going to repurpose this space. We have it set up as one of our training classrooms for both pilots and flight attendants, both from the 1960s. You would spend half a day out there with the training boards and all that other stuff, or jumping in and out of the pool. And then you'd come into class and take multiple choice tests all afternoon and respond electronically. And the instructor from the podium up there could see who's getting it and who's not.
Now, were those multiple choice or multiple guess?
Hopefully it's multiple choice.
That's the only way I got through school, was multiple guess. Now we're we're in a room that has 4 large tables, probably 10 foot long, with several chairs. You got 4 stations with your multiple choice buttons, and you've got a big map. You've got several maps, and you've got all of the interior controls for your cockpit. And this is where they tested you to see just how well you were doing. Okay, now what's this room? We just walked into a room that's got a bar, several planes hanging from the ceiling, lots of posters, some nice lounge chairs.
Increasingly, people want to rent the museum as a destination for business meetings, for cocktail parties, for high school proms, all kinds of things like that. So we needed a place where we could have a fully functioning bar for cocktail parties.
Okay.
So we've set this up as a 1960s era ambassadors club.
And that's what it looks like.
And that's what we have.
Yes.
These, however, are not original. These are a recent addition. These came from the estate of Howard Hughes, and these were allegedly in one of his offices in California.
Really?
And all I can say is, man, did he have bad taste in furniture.
Well, but at the time, it was probably the highest class thing. We're looking at a chair and a sofa. They're done in kind of a black and white checkerboard Aztec design cloth. They've got carvings on the armrests and coming on up the back. They're really fancy looking chairs, but at the same time, like you said, they're not very pretty.
And these are not original as well. We have a mechanic volunteer who makes cocktail tables out of 707 wheels.
That is cool. No tire on it, but the actual wheel, and has a glass top on top.
These were the original front doors of the Ambassadors Club in St. Louis.
Right here?
Yep.
Okay.
When American took over in 2001, they were getting ready to throw these in a dumpster. And we said, no, we'll take those. And we got them over here, got them all mounted and lights mounted and everything, and we stood back to admire our work. And somebody said, wait a minute, the United States is over here and Europe is over there. So then we took it back apart and flipped the panels, and fortunately now all the continents are in the right place.
Oh, that's good. Nothing like real life in it when you're too late.
All the airplane interiors had been redone, very conservative colors, like the seats you saw over there, blue and red and all that. But in the 1970s, There were 19 different seat upholstery patterns,
Really?
and every station had to stock 19 different replacement cushions in case some kid threw up on a seat.
Wow.
And it was a vibrant color everywhere, and behind you on the wall, these were the murals that were on the forward bulkhead of every 747 and every 1011
Really?
when they were first delivered.
Now this one here must have been from Spain. It's got a bullfighter with his
They're-
sword. Well,
they
I
were
guess
all
it's all
different.
over Europe.
Yeah, they're all different. And I'd be on this end and somebody else on the other end, and we'd flip it, and the other side is the movie screen.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And this was before video cassettes, so every cabin had projectors built into the ceiling, complete with the whole movie on a big reel up there in the ceiling above the cabin. I ended up having to go to 3 days of projector training in Kansas City to figure out how to rethread the projector and splice the movie back together.
Wow.
And somebody once asked me, he said, wait a minute, you're going to stand on top of somebody's seat in the middle of the night on the North Atlantic with a flashlight clenched in your teeth and try to rethread the projector? And I said, you betcha.
Yeah.
Because that's a heck of a lot easier than refunding 368 headsets.
Oh, yeah.
Angry passengers.
And in
Wow.
reality, I very quickly figured out, the movie's frequently broke. I quickly figured out if I could just rethread the projector, I didn't have to bother to splice anything. The remedy for that was a huge trash bag. And you just ran the rest of the movie into the trash.
Wow.
And then throw it in the lab for landing. And a separate company serviced those on the ground. So their people would get on in London or Paris and Rome and say, where is the return movie? And I'd say it's in the trash in the lab.
Wow. So you had to stand on the seat
Yep,
as you filled up the bag?
yep.
Wow. We're walking through some other areas that have more flight simulators, posters on the wall, and that type of stuff. And now we're in here to a fuselage. Wow. Now, what caused the demise of TWA? I know we're not supposed to get into this, but let's do it anyway.
The only way we finally got rid of Carl Icahn is he forced us to sign an agreement that he could buy as many tickets as he wanted at a 40% discount.
Okay.
And this was before the internet really took off. So we thought, what harm can he do?
Okay.
He formed a new company called cheaptickets.com.
Oh.
And at one point, 40% of the people on our airplanes were traveling on cheap 40% off Carl Icahn tickets.
Really?
Somebody told me from the marketing department back in about 1995 that our break-even load factor with Carl Icahn tickets was like 140%.
Wow. And so, was he destroying the company before
Oh, of
the
course.
buyout? What kind of was going
He
on? With some
sold
of that?
everything that wasn't fastened down and then leased it back to TWA at exorbitant prices. He sold, Wall Street analysts still laugh at what are called the light bulb bonds.
Okay.
We had like 1 million light bulbs in inventory at the overhaul base for everything possible. He sold them all and then issued bonds based upon the value of the light bulbs and pocketed the money.
Wow.
Landing rights in Heathrow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
So landing rights in Heathrow
Oh, yeah.
were a huge thing.
He
And
sold-
did that everywhere.
He sold all the route authority into Heathrow. Traditionally, only 2 American airlines were permitted at Heathrow, Pan Am and TWA. Carl started the ball rolling by selling all of our rights to American, and we no longer could land at Heathrow. We'd been operating there since World War II and couldn't land there.
And the stockholders didn't hold his feet to the fire or anything? Or?
They loved it because he was promising them huge returns, which never materialized.
Wow.
A little bit of background. There's a guy in Los Angeles who's still an active United Airlines employee, to the best of my knowledge, who's been buying up bits and pieces of 747s. in the boneyards out there. And he has built the front third of a Pan Am 747 in a warehouse in Los Angeles. And you pay a whole bunch of money up front, and you show up at the appointed time at this warehouse, and you are met at the door of this mock-up with a glass of champagne, and you sit down in the mock-up, and they pour a whole lot more champagne and start the appetizers, and you sit in the mock-up and watch a movie on the history of Pan Am. And then retired Pan Am flight attendants in their original uniforms do the entire multi-course Pan Am transatlantic dinner service in the mock-up.
Really?
Whole thing takes about 4 or 5 hours. It's expensive. I've done it, and it's worth it. There were people that flew in from Australia and Hawaii to do this.
Really?
Yeah. Now, with that as background, American had no interest in any of the TWA people or the facilities or anything. They wanted the routes and the airplanes, and that's it. In St. Louis at our training center, initially here in Kansas City, then in Overland Park at our training facility there, ultimately in St. Louis, we had galley mock-ups, door trainers, emergency exit trainers for everything that we operated. American bulldozed all of it, just destroyed millions of dollars worth of equipment. They missed one, this one.
And you've got it here.
And the reason they missed it is because it was in an area of the building they didn't use.
Wow.
When they took over. So we found out it was there. I remembered where it was, and I measured it, and I measured 4 times because I knew the size of this room, and we came in with about 18 inches to spare if we removed the control panel, which was initially mounted in the front, but it wouldn't fit.
Okay.
This originally was our emergency evacuation trainer for flight attendants. The instructor could, from that panel up there, lock and unlock different wing exits and doors. He or she could push a button and fill the interior with dense white smoke so you couldn't see. I seem to remember tape recordings of people screaming and yelling. And then an evacuation alarm would go off, and it was your job to figure out which exits were usable, get the doors open, the slides inflated, and evacuate the cabin. And we all knew that it was that door that worked because that was the one with the functioning slide on it. And we would get that door open, inflate the slide, and then force everybody to jump the slide. And in reality, you went from the first floor of the building into the basement.
Okay.
So it survived. We got it over here.
Wow. That's amazing. Now, you guys trained kind of constantly.
Yep. You had to go back to training every year.
And did you ever have an opportunity to use your training? I mean, what happens? I know that all the training in the world doesn't prepare you for an actual situation. I mean, it prepares you, but it doesn't put you into the adrenaline rush, panic mode. And how did that actually work out between training and reality when these situations happened?
In 27 years, I had one emergency.
Okay.
And you really want to hear this?
Sure.
It was an early morning L-1011 flight from Denver to St. Louis, light load, and there were about 30 or 40 commuting crew members, pilots and flight attendants on board, traveling on passes to St. Louis to go to work.
Okay.
They lowered the landing gear for landing in St. Louis, and I heard an explosion, and something on the left main landing gear separated from the airplane.
Ooh.
And they had an indication in the cockpit that the left main landing gear was not down and locked. So we did the circling thing, we did the low flyby of the tower. We couldn't crank it because allegedly part of the hydraulics had left the airplane. I was the service manager, so I had a couple of things to do. We were doing all the emergency announcements about, the brace position and all of that. There's typically 2 kinds of panic in an evacuation, positive and negative. The positive people are going to get out no matter what. The negative people are going to be frozen with fear and won't move no matter what. I detected a wee bit too much positive panic as we went through. So I asked everyone seated anywhere near one of the doors to move into the middle of the cabin. and I reseated all my commuting crew members around the doors, and I said, you are not going to open that door unless you're specifically ordered to by the evacuation alarm or the captain. And they all agreed to that. I couldn't get one of the bar carts in the first class galley upstairs off the fitting on the floor to get it downstairs. The thing weighs about 300 pounds, fully loaded, and it's sitting right across from my jump seat, and I didn't want to be wearing it in a crash. So I'm fiddling with it on the floor, and I broke my thumb, and my thumb is now back this way, and so I very quickly modified my thumb. But the captain, first time I've ever seen a captain really sweat.
Okay.
He did not think that the left main gear was going to hold, and the airplane would most likely ground loop. So that's what we were prepared for, but it did hold.
Wow.
So we came to a screeching halt on the runway, and the captain made an announcement, nobody move, because the left main gear is unsafe, and until we can pin it, anybody moving could throw the weight and balance off, and the gear could collapse. So I said, okay, fine, we can do that. And then he called me to the cockpit. He said, we've already got the gear pinned. It's safe. But it's going to take an hour to get buses and stairs out here to get people off the airplane. And I said, okay, but I've got 30 commuting pilots and flight attendants that need to get to work, or they're going to be in big trouble with crew scheduling if they don't get out of here and get to the airport. And he said, what do you propose? I said, I have an idea, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. Don't ask any questions. And he said, fine, I don't want to know. In twos, I took him into the lower galley on the L1011. There's a galley service door in that lower galley. I opened the galley service door, which is about a 5.5-foot drop from the galley floor onto the ground. I had them grab my arms, and I'd grab their arms, and I started dropping them out of the airplane onto the ramp, onto the runway, actually.
Right.
And then I'd kick their bags out behind them, and they would grab their bags, and they took off running for the airport terminal to go to work. And I'll never forget the look on the crash crew faces, the fire people and the ambulance drivers and all of that, when uniformed crew members started dropping out of the bottom of the airplane and running for the airport.
Wow.
That's my story. What can I say?
Well,
Yeah.
it's
So, the reason I told you that heartwarming Pan Am story is because on a much smaller, simpler scale, we hope to do something similar one day in here, if we ever finish it. And that's why these are not the original seats. These are first class seats, not the original coach seats. And if we're gonna make you pay to eat in here, then we want you to be a little more comfortable.
Most
than you would be
definitely.
ordinarily.
Wow. That's a neat idea. Hopefully it works.
So this is technically based on a 727 regular, and this is exactly the way the galley was set up. Just like this 707 one was just like this.
Right.
Just imagine that you've got a full load, and you're the first class flight attendant working in here, and there's 2 coach flight attendants working in here. So there's 3 of us in there.
There's not a lot of room.
No, there's not.
Wow. But at least you can close the curtain so nobody can see how much room you don't have.
And that's the first thing we do is close the curtain.
Wow. So are we getting close to
The end of the trail.
or
Yep.
Do
we're
we
dangerously
have quite a bit more to go
close.
see?
Nope, you're dangerously close to the end.
Dangerously close.
As mentioned, American really wasn't interested in anything but routes and airplanes. But in about 2003, 2004, they had a 757 that was damaged in a hailstorm here in Kansas City.
Okay.
And we said, you know what? Our mechanics are the best in the business. We'll send some people over to take a look at it for you. And they said, no thanks. We want our mechanics to fly up from Tulsa to look at the airplane. And we said, okay, you're on your own. So Americans people came up, they looked at the airplane, they said it's a total hull loss, it cannot be repaired. After they left, our people said, we'll fix it. And we did. This is a chunk of it. The airplane was repaired and went back into service and flew for about another 15 or 16 years.
Wow.
And when it was finally retired, we were able to cut a chunk of the fuselage out, and we invited all the mechanics that did the original repair to autograph their work. And that's what you see. About a month ago, I had a young guy in his 20s come through here, and he said, well, my grandfather rather, was a mechanic for TWA. And he looked up there and found his grandfather's name.
Really?
Yep.
That's awesome.
Karen's looking for her dad's name.
He may or may not be there.
No.
The Los Angeles Airport Authority called us several years ago and said, we're getting ready to tear your hangar down. And they said, you still got stuff out here, do you want it? We said, yeah, we want everything you've got. They apparently took us at our word because they even sent us the payphones from the hangar floor.
We got 2 payphone booths. Wow. That's funny.
And you've seen it. This is it.
This is awesome.
But feel free to go back through and take a look at anything in greater detail, and I'll be around to answer your questions. But
Well, I got a couple more questions.
Sure, ask away.
Or at least one more. How is this financed? Is it financed through TWA? Is there still some sort of a
No,
grant?
it's
or
purely volunteers.
purely volunteers?
Volunteers and donations.
And it's owned by the city or
The city owns the building.
Okay.
The city leases this building to Signature Flight Support, who's the
Okay.
fixed base operator here, and we pay rent to Signature. So far, knock on wood, we're doing reasonably well. We're in the black. We have a couple of fundraisers a year. We have, in fact, just coming up, the third weekend in April, we always completely empty the hangar here and have a 1930s big band orchestra, and people dress up in 1930s clothes.
Wow.
And people drink too much and have way too much fun. That's coming up. We had the first one in 3 years because of COVID just last year. And I think we had over 500 people.
Wow, that is
so we make
awesome.
some money there.
That's cool.
We have gotten donations from some corporations, but primarily it's through people coming through.
Wow.
And there is a small gift shop. You're invited to spend lavishly.
Okay,
We make
we'll go
money
take
off
a
you
look.
in the gift shop, and that's how we do it.
Well, Larry, I so much appreciate you taking your time. I know you said that your normal tours last about an hour. We're now running an hour and 45 minutes or so.
Are we really?
We are. But
Oh my
this has
gosh.
been fantastic. You've talked a lot and answered all my questions and told me so much more than what I ever even imagined was going to be here.
As I said when I started, I can't do justice to the pilots or the mechanics folks. They're equally important in the story to be told here. And we just don't have any pilots or mechanics here to talk to you today.
Well, you've been awesome. So I always
Do
finish...
credit to the pilots and the mechanics.
Good. I always finish out my podcasts by saying the world is full of wonder. Kansas City is a cool place. People need to get out and explore. There's so much to see here, and this museum is so worth the visit.
And oh, by the way, if you fly in, you're now going to go into, finally, a world-class, brand new airport terminal.
Here in Kansas
here
City.
in Kansas City, which is
Wow.
absolutely gorgeous. It just opened 3 weeks ago.
Really? Okay. Well, remember that too.
Okay.
And everybody have an absolutely wonder-filled day. And just as a side note, you can check out the Facebook page at Where Am I to Go Podcast on Facebook. And our website is whereamitogo.com. Thank you.
And TWAmuseum.org.
TWAmuseum.org. I should have got that. I forgot. Thank you, Larry.
All the roll and go, where am I to go? Meet Johnny, where am I to go? For I'm a young and a sailor lad, and where am I to go?